The blizzard came so fast that Grace Kendrick barely had time to unhitch her horse before the world turned white, swallowing the road she had traveled just moments before, in a fury of wind and ice that seemed determined to erase every trace of civilization from the New Mexico territory. She stood in the doorway of her small homestead, 22 years old and suddenly very aware of how alone she was, watching the snow pile against the fence posts with a speed that made her stomach clench with fear. The winter of 1881 had been mild until now, lulling everyone in Oro Grande into believing they might escape the worst of the season. But nature had other plans. Grace had come to New Mexico 3 years ago with her father, a man who had dreams of mining silver and building an empire in the Southwest. Those dreams died with him 6 months past, buried in a cave-in that also took 4 other miners and left Grace with a small piece of land, a sturdy horse, and a determination to make something of herself despite the odds. The homestead was modest but well built, with thick adobe walls that her father had insisted upon, saying they would keep her cool in summer and warm in winter. She had never tested that second claim until now. The wind howled like a living thing, and Grace pushed the door closed with both hands, throwing the heavy wooden bolt into place. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled cheerfully, oblivious to the storm raging outside. She had enough wood stacked by the fireplace to last several days, and her pantry held beans, flour, dried meat, and preserves. She would be fine, she told herself. She had survived worse than a snowstorm. But as the hours passed and the wind only grew stronger, Grace began to worry. The snow was piling against the door, and when she looked out the single window, she could see nothing but white. The world had disappeared. She was an island in a sea of ice, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt truly afraid. Miles away in Oro Grande, Benjamin Everett stood at the window of the general store, watching the storm with growing concern. He was 26 years old, tall and lean with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working cattle under the harsh southwestern sun. His dark hair was perpetually in need of a trim, and his hands were calloused from rope and leather, but his eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. "Worst storm I have seen in 20 years," old Mr. Patterson said from behind the counter, wrapping a scarf around his neck in preparation for the short walk to his house next door. "You best get yourself home before you cannot find your way, Ben." Benjamin nodded absently, but his thoughts were not on his own safety. He was thinking about Grace Kendrick, living alone on that homestead 5 miles outside of town. He had met her several times over the past months, always finding excuses to ride out that direction, always hoping to catch a glimpse of her working in her garden or tending to her horse. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest tight, with dark auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and green eyes that seemed to see right through all his carefully constructed defenses. He had never been good with words, had never known how to tell her that he thought about her constantly, that he lay awake at night imagining what it would be like to have the right to protect her, to build a life with her. Instead, he had offered to help with repairs, had brought her venison from his hunts, had done everything but actually speak the truth that burned in his heart. And now she was out there alone, and the snow was coming down so thick that he could barely see the building across the street. "I need to go," Benjamin said suddenly, turning from the window. Mr. Patterson looked at him with concern creasing his weathered face. "Go where?" "Ben, you will freeze to death out there. The temperature is dropping fast and that wind will cut right through you." "Grace Kendrick is alone at her homestead," Benjamin said, already moving toward the door where his coat hung on a peg. "She does not have anyone to check on her." "That is 5 miles in good weather," Mr. Patterson protested. "In this storm, you will never make it. You will lose your way and freeze." Benjamin pulled on his heavy coat, wrapping his scarf around his face. "I have to try. I cannot just leave her out there." He could see the understanding dawn in the old man's eyes, followed by resignation. "Take my lantern," Mr. Patterson said quietly. "And God go with you, boy." Benjamin nodded his thanks and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. The wind drove snow into every gap in his clothing, and within seconds he could feel the moisture beginning to freeze. He had left his horse at the livery stable, and he made his way there by memory more than sight, the world around him reduced to a whirling mass of white. The stable boy, a Mexican kid named Carlos who could not have been more than 15, looked at Benjamin like he was insane when he asked for his horse to be saddled. "Señor, you cannot ride in this. You will die." "Maybe," Benjamin agreed, "but I cannot leave her out there alone." Carlos studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. A woman, Benjamin confirmed. "Then I will pray for you," Carlos said, and set about preparing the horse with quick, efficient movements. The ride out of town was a nightmare. Benjamin could barely see his horse's ears in front of him, and the animal stumbled frequently in the deepening drifts. The wind howled around them, and the cold was so intense it made his teeth ache. He kept the lantern lit, though it did little good in the storm, and tried to follow the road by instinct and memory. Every landmark was obliterated, every familiar sight erased by the endless white. His hands grew numb inside his gloves, and his face felt like it was made of wood. He could no longer feel his feet in his boots. The horse moved slowly, laboriously, fighting through drifts that sometimes reached its chest. Time ceased to have meaning. Benjamin knew only forward motion, the struggle to stay in the saddle, the determination to reach Grace. He almost missed the homestead entirely. It was only because his horse shied away from the fence that he realized they had arrived. The small adobe structure was nearly invisible, buried in snow up to the windowsill. Benjamin dismounted, his legs nearly giving out beneath him as his frozen feet hit the ground. He tied his horse to the fence post with stiff fingers, then fought his way through the drifts to the door. He pounded on it with numb fists, calling out, "Grace, Grace, it is Benjamin Everett." For a terrible moment, there was no response, and Benjamin felt panic surge through his chest. Then he heard the sound of the bolt being drawn back, and the door opened a crack. Grace stared at him in shock, her green eyes wide with disbelief. "Benjamin, what are you doing here?" "Checking on you," he managed through frozen lips. "The storm. You rode out in this." Her voice rose with incredulity and something else, something that might have been fear. "Are you insane? You could have died. Can I come in?" Benjamin asked, suddenly aware that he was shaking violently, his body's attempt to generate warmth. Grace seemed to realize the state he was in, and she pulled the door wide, grabbing his arm and hauling him inside. The warmth of the room hit him like a wall, and the shaking intensified. Grace slammed the door shut and bolted it, then turned to him with a mixture of fury and concern on her face. "You absolute fool," she said, but her hands were already working at the buttons of his coat, pulling the frozen fabric away from his body. "You could have frozen to death." "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking you were out here alone," Benjamin said, his voice shaking along with his body. "I was thinking I could not just leave you." Grace looked up at him, and something flickered in her eyes that made his heart stutter. But then she was all business again, pulling him toward the fire, making him sit in the chair closest to the hearth. She disappeared for a moment and returned with blankets, wrapping them around his shoulders. "Your hands," she said, kneeling in front of him and taking his hands in hers. She began to rub them gently, working warmth back into the frozen flesh. Her touch was gentle but firm, and Benjamin watched her face in the firelight, memorizing every curve and angle. "I had to make sure you were safe," he said quietly. "Safe." Grace looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes now. "What good would my safety do if you died trying to reach me? Benjamin, that was the most foolish, reckless thing anyone has ever done for me." "I would do it again," he said simply. Grace stared at him, her hand still holding his, and something shifted in the air between them. "Why?" she whispered. Benjamin knew this was the moment. He could retreat behind safe words and careful distance, or he could tell her the truth that had been burning in his chest for months. The ride through the storm had stripped away his hesitation, had shown him exactly how fragile life was and how quickly it could be lost. "Because I love you," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I have loved you since the first time I saw you in town, arguing with the banker about your father's debts. You were so fierce, so determined, and I thought I had never seen anyone more beautiful. I tried to tell myself it was just admiration, just concern for a neighbor, but I was lying to myself. I love you, Grace. I love everything about you, and the thought of you out here alone in this storm, maybe hurt or scared or worse, it was more than I could stand." Grace's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks. "You could have died," she said again, but this time her voice broke on the words. "I know," Benjamin said gently, "but loving you is worth any risk." Grace made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then she was leaning forward, her hands coming up to cup his face. "You impossible man," she whispered. And then she kissed him. Benjamin's world narrowed to the warmth of her lips, the softness of her hands on his face, the way she tasted like honey and hope. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, feeling the shaking in his body subside as her warmth seeped into him. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but then deepened into something that spoke of months of longing and the terror of nearly losing each other. When they finally pulled apart, Grace rested her forehead against his, her breath coming fast. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to admit it, even to myself. After my father died, I told myself I could not afford to need anyone, that I had to be strong on my own. But I have thought about you every day. I have waited for your visits, made excuses to go into town on days I thought you might be there. I love you, Benjamin Everett, and you terrify me." "Why do I terrify you?" Benjamin asked, his hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Because I lost my father," Grace said, her voice shaking. "I lost the person I loved most in this world, and the pain of it nearly destroyed me. And now you have proven that you would risk your life for me, and I am so afraid of losing you too." "You will not lose me," Benjamin promised. "I am not going anywhere." "You cannot promise that," Grace said, but she was leaning into his touch, her eyes closing. "No," Benjamin admitted. "But I can promise to fight like hell to stay with you. I can promise that whatever time we have, I will spend it loving you with everything I have." Grace opened her eyes, and in them Benjamin saw his own feelings reflected back at him. Love, fear, hope, and determination all mixed together. "That is all anyone can promise," she said softly. "I suppose that will have to be enough." "Is it?" Benjamin asked. "Enough, I mean," Grace smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Yes," she said simply. "It is enough." They sat together by the fire as the storm raged outside, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms. Benjamin's body slowly thawed, the painful tingling in his extremities gradually fading to a dull ache. Grace heated soup, and they ate it while she told him about her life since her father's death, about the struggles and small victories of running the homestead alone, about the loneliness that had become her constant companion. "I tried so hard to be strong," she said, staring into her bowl. "My father always said I was tough as nails, that I could survive anything. And I wanted to prove him right, to show that his faith in me was not misplaced. But there were nights when I just sat by this fire and cried, feeling so alone I thought I might disappear entirely." "You are strong," Benjamin said firmly. "The strongest person I know. But being strong does not mean you have to be alone, Grace. It does not mean you cannot let someone stand beside you." "Is that what you want?" Grace asked, looking up at him. "To stand beside me?" "I want to stand beside you," Benjamin said. "I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to help you run this homestead, to build something together. I want to marry you, Grace, if you will have me." Grace's breath caught, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "We have only just admitted we love each other," she said, but there was no rejection in her voice, only wonder. "I know," Benjamin said. "And if you need time, I will wait. I will court you properly, bring you flowers and take you on buggy rides and do all the things a man is supposed to do. But I also just rode 5 miles through a blizzard that could have killed me, and it has made me realize that life is too short and too uncertain to waste time on pretense. I love you. I want to spend my life with you. Everything else is just details." Grace set down her bowl and turned to face him fully. In the firelight she looked almost ethereal, her auburn hair glowing like copper, her green eyes bright with tears and something deeper, something that made Benjamin's heart race. "Yes," she said simply. Benjamin blinked. "Yes." "Yes, I will marry you," Grace said, and a smile broke across her face, radiant and joyful. "You are right. Life is too short. My father taught me to be practical, but he also taught me to recognize what matters. And you matter, Benjamin. You rode through a blizzard for me. You have been kind and patient and good, and I love you. So yes, I will marry you." Benjamin pulled her close and kissed her again, pouring all his relief and joy and love into the connection between them. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small adobe homestead, there was only warmth and light and the beginning of something beautiful. They talked through the night, making plans and sharing dreams while the snow piled higher outside. Benjamin told her about his small ranch, about the cattle he was building a herd with, about his hopes to expand and create something lasting. Grace told him about her father's silver claim, which she had been unable to work alone but which still held promise if properly managed. "We could combine our efforts," Benjamin suggested. "I have the ranch, you have the land and the claim. Together we could build something neither of us could manage alone." "A partnership," Grace said, and the word felt right, felt like more than just a business arrangement. "In everything," Benjamin agreed. As dawn approached, the storm finally began to ease. The wind died down, and the snow fell more gently, no longer driven by the furious gusts that had made the world invisible. Benjamin went out to check on his horse, fighting through drifts that reached past his waist in places. The poor animal was still tied to the fence post, covered in a thick layer of snow but alive. Benjamin led it to the small lean-to that served as Grace's stable, rubbing the horse down and giving it grain from her supply. When he returned to the house, Grace had breakfast waiting. Eggs from her chickens, which had weathered the storm in their coop, and fresh bread she must have baked the day before. They ate together as the pale winter sun began to rise, painting the endless expanse of white with shades of pink and gold. "It is beautiful," Grace said, looking out the window at the transformed landscape. "Beautiful and deadly," Benjamin said. "The road will be impassable for days." "I should have thought of that before I rode out." "So you are stuck here with me," Grace said, and there was a teasing note in her voice that made Benjamin smile. "I can think of worse fates," he said. They spent the next 3 days snowed in together, and it felt like a gift. Without the demands of the outside world pressing in on them, they had time to simply be together, to learn each other's rhythms and habits, to fall deeper in love with every passing hour. Benjamin repaired things around the homestead that Grace had been unable to fix on her own, and Grace taught him how to make the tortillas and beans that her Mexican neighbors had shown her. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their childhoods, their hopes and fears, their favorite things. Benjamin learned that Grace had a passion for reading and had brought a trunk full of books from back east. Grace learned that Benjamin could play the harmonica and had dreamed of being a musician before practical concerns and family obligations had led him to ranching instead. On the 4th day, the sun shone bright and warm, and the snow began to melt rapidly. The road would still be difficult, but it was passable for a man on horseback. Benjamin knew he needed to return to town, to let people know he had survived, to attend to his own ranch and responsibilities. But the thought of leaving Grace made his chest ache. "Come with me," he said as they stood together in the doorway, watching the snow drip from the roof. "I cannot leave the homestead unattended," Grace said practically. "The animals need care, and if the thaw continues, I will need to deal with any damage the storm caused." "Then I will come back tomorrow," Benjamin said, "and the day after that and every day until we can be married." "How soon can we be married?" Grace asked, and the eagerness in her voice made Benjamin grin. "As soon as we can get the preacher to agree to it," he said. "A week, maybe 2 at most." 2 weeks, Grace said, testing the words. "I can wait 2 weeks." Benjamin kissed her slow and thorough, trying to memorize the taste of her the way she fit against him. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you too," Grace whispered back. "Ride safe." The journey back to Oro Grande was long and exhausting, with Benjamin having to dismount frequently to lead his horse through deep drifts. But his heart was light, and he found himself grinning like a fool at nothing, remembering the way Grace had looked at him, the promises they had made to each other. When he finally rode into town, nearly frozen again but infinitely happier than when he had left, he found the entire population worried and waiting. Mr. Patterson nearly wept with relief when Benjamin walked into the general store, and Carlos from the livery stable crossed himself and muttered prayers of thanksgiving in Spanish. "You made it to her?" Mr. Patterson asked. "I made it," Benjamin confirmed. "And she is fine. We are both fine." "And?" the old man prompted, studying Benjamin's face with knowing eyes. "And we are getting married," Benjamin said. Unable to keep the joy from his voice, Mr. Patterson let out a whoop of laughter and slapped Benjamin on the back hard enough to make him stagger. "About time, boy. I have been watching you moon over that girl for months. When is the wedding?" 2 weeks, Benjamin said. "I need to speak with Reverend Mitchell." The news spread through Oro Grande like wildfire, and by evening it seemed the entire town knew that Benjamin Everett was marrying Grace Kendrick. The women began planning immediately, offering to help Grace with her dress, to prepare food for a celebration, to decorate the small church. The men clapped Benjamin on the back and offered congratulations mixed with good-natured ribbing about being caught in the parson's trap. Benjamin rode out to Grace's homestead every day, as he had promised. Sometimes he brought supplies from town, gifts from the well-wishers who had taken up their cause. Other times he brought nothing but himself and his love for her. They spent their days working side by side, preparing both the homestead and Benjamin's ranch for their combined future, and their evenings talking and planning and stealing kisses in the twilight. Grace came into town with Benjamin 1 week before the wedding to meet with Reverend Mitchell and make the final arrangements. She was greeted like a celebrity, with women streaming out of their homes and shops to embrace her and offer congratulations. Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, had organized the entire town's women into a committee dedicated to making sure the wedding was perfect. "We have not had a proper wedding in Oro Grande in over a year," Mrs. Patterson explained, bustling Grace into the back room of the store where several other women waited with armfuls of fabric and lace. "You are going to be beautiful, dear. Now, let us see what we can do about a dress." Grace looked overwhelmed, and Benjamin squeezed her hand before releasing it. "I will be at the saloon if you need me," he said, grinning at her expression of mingled excitement and panic. At the saloon, Benjamin found himself surrounded by the men of the town, all wanting to buy him drinks and offer advice on marriage. Some of it was useful, most of it was ribald, and all of it was given with genuine affection. Benjamin had lived in Oro Grande for 5 years, and these men were more than neighbors. They were friends, the closest thing to family he had since his own had scattered across the West. "You are a lucky man," said John Morrison, a rancher who ran cattle adjacent to Benjamin's property. "Grace Kendrick is quality, beautiful, smart, hard-working. You better treat her right." "I intend to," Benjamin said seriously. "Good," John said, nodding. "Because if you do not, you will answer to the rest of us." It was said with a smile, but Benjamin heard the truth beneath it. Grace had been alone and vulnerable after her father's death, and the community had worried about her. Now that she was going to be protected, cared for, they wanted to make sure Benjamin understood the responsibility he was taking on. "I love her," Benjamin said simply. "I would die before I hurt her." "We know," John said, clapping him on the shoulder. "That is why we are happy for you both." The wedding took place on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks to the day after Benjamin had ridden through the blizzard to reach Grace. The little church was packed with people, every pew filled and more standing in the back. Grace walked down the aisle alone, having no father to give her away, but she held her head high, and her eyes found Benjamin's immediately, locking onto him like a lifeline. She was beautiful beyond words. Mrs. Patterson and the other women had created a dress of cream-colored silk that hugged her figure and flowed around her like water. Her auburn hair was pinned up with small white flowers woven through it, and her green eyes shone with joy and love and barely suppressed tears. Benjamin felt his own eyes burning as she came to stand beside him. Reverend Mitchell began the ceremony, his voice sonorous and warm, but Benjamin barely heard the words. He was too focused on Grace, on the way her hand trembled slightly in his, on the smile that curved her lips, on the absolute rightness of this moment. When it came time for the vows, Benjamin spoke clearly and firmly, promising to love her, honor her, cherish her, protect her, for as long as they both lived. Grace's voice shook with emotion, but her words were just as clear, just as certain. And when Reverend Mitchell finally pronounced them husband and wife, Benjamin pulled Grace into his arms and kissed her with all the love and joy and relief that filled his heart. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and Benjamin laughed against Grace's lips, feeling happier than he had ever imagined possible. The celebration afterward was held at the largest building in Oro Grande, the community hall that served for town meetings and social gatherings. The women had prepared a feast, and there was music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Benjamin danced with Grace until his feet hurt and then danced some more, unable to let her go, unable to stop touching her, reassuring himself that this was real, that she was his wife now. "Happy?" he asked as they swayed together to a slow song, her head resting on his shoulder. "Happier than I thought possible," Grace murmured. "Thank you for riding through that storm." "Thank you for letting me in," Benjamin replied. They left the celebration late, riding together on Benjamin's horse out to his ranch, which would now be their home. Grace had already moved most of her belongings in the days before the wedding, but this was the first time she would see it as mistress of the house, as Benjamin's wife. The ranch was modest but well kept, with a sturdy house that Benjamin had built himself over the course of 2 years. It was larger than Grace's homestead, with separate rooms for sleeping and cooking, and a porch that looked out over the pastures where Benjamin's cattle grazed. Inside, Benjamin had spent the past week preparing, cleaning every surface until it shone, putting fresh linens on the bed, making everything as welcoming as he could. Grace walked through the room slowly, running her hands over the furniture, peering into cabinets, examining everything with the eye of someone who was seeing her future unfold before her. Benjamin followed her, nervous suddenly, hoping she would like it, hoping it would feel like home to her. In the bedroom, Grace turned to him, and the look in her eyes made Benjamin's breath catch. "It is perfect," she said softly. "Everything is perfect." Benjamin crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "I want to make you happy," he said. "That is all I want, Grace. To build a good life with you, to make you smile every day, to give you everything you deserve." "You have already given me everything," Grace said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "You gave me yourself. You gave me love. You gave me a future I thought I had lost. That is more than I ever dreamed of having." Benjamin kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Grace melted against him. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's hearts over the past weeks. It was tender and sweet and occasionally awkward in the way of first times, but it was perfect because it was theirs, because it was the physical expression of everything they felt for each other. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Grace's head on Benjamin's chest, his arms wrapped around her. "I used to be so afraid of the future," Grace said quietly. "After my father died, every day felt like a battle just to survive, and I could not imagine what my life would look like in a year, in 5 years. I felt like I was just existing, not really living." "And now?" Benjamin asked, his hand stroking through her hair. "Now I cannot wait to see what comes next," Grace said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "Now I have dreams again, I have hope." "Tell me your dreams," Benjamin said softly. Grace was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I dream of children," she said finally. "Sons and daughters who will run through these rooms and grow up strong and loved. I dream of growing old with you, of sitting on that porch in 30 years and watching the sunset together. I dream of building something that lasts, something that matters." "Those are good dreams," Benjamin said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I promise you, Grace, I will do everything in my power to make them come true." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms and in the promise of the future they would build together. The first year of their marriage was not easy. Combining 2 properties and 2 lives took work, especially in the harsh environment of the New Mexico territory. There were cattle to care for, crops to plant, the silver claim to explore and eventually develop. There were droughts and sickness in the herd and 100 small disasters that had to be managed. But through it all, Benjamin and Grace faced everything together. On the hard days, when nothing seemed to go right and Benjamin came home exhausted and discouraged, Grace would wrap her arms around him and remind him of how far they had come. On the days when Grace felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the work ahead of them, Benjamin would take her hands and tell her stories of the future he saw, of the life they were building one day at a time. They learned to work together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs, communicating in the shorthand of people who knew each other deeply. Benjamin learned to read Grace's moods, to know when she needed comfort and when she needed space. Grace learned Benjamin's tells, the way he got quiet when he was worried, the way his jaw tightened when he was angry but trying not to show it. And through it all, their love deepened and strengthened, becoming the bedrock on which everything else was built. In the spring of their second year together, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for several weeks but had been afraid to hope, afraid to speak it aloud in case she was wrong. But when she finally told Benjamin, his reaction banished all her fears. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands cupping her face, his eyes searching hers. "I am sure," Grace said, smiling through happy tears. "We are going to have a baby." Benjamin kissed her, long and deep, and when he pulled back, his own eyes were wet. "I love you," he said. "I love you so much, Grace." "I love you too," Grace whispered. The pregnancy was not easy. Grace suffered from sickness in the early months that left her weak and exhausted. Benjamin fretted over her constantly, trying to find foods she could tolerate, rubbing her back when she was ill, sitting with her through the long nights when she could not sleep. As she grew larger, moving became difficult, and Benjamin took over most of the heavy work around the ranch, refusing to let Grace do anything that might strain her. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," Grace protested one afternoon when Benjamin physically lifted her away from the basket of laundry she had been trying to hang. "I know," Benjamin said, setting her gently in a chair on the porch, "but I am not taking any chances with you or the baby." "Let me take care of you, Grace." She wanted to argue, but the tender concern in his eyes melted her irritation. "You are impossible," she said fondly. "And you love me anyway," Benjamin replied with a grin. "I do," Grace admitted. "Heaven help me, I really do." Their son was born on a cold December night in 1883, 2 years after the blizzard that had brought Benjamin to Grace's door. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Benjamin feared he would lose both Grace and the baby. He paced outside the bedroom where the midwife worked, praying more fervently than he ever had in his life, bargaining with God to please let them be all right. When he finally heard the thin, reedy cry of a newborn, Benjamin nearly collapsed with relief. Mrs. Patterson, who had assisted the midwife, came out with a tired but triumphant smile. "You have a son," she said, "and your wife is asking for you." Benjamin rushed into the bedroom to find Grace propped up against pillows, exhausted and pale but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up as he entered, and the love in her eyes took his breath away. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Benjamin approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were still unfocused, but might someday be the same green as his mother's. He was perfect. "He is beautiful," Benjamin said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did so well, Grace. I am so proud of you." "We made him together," Grace said, smiling. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, unable to agree on anything that felt right. But looking at his son now, Benjamin knew. "Thomas," he said. "After your father." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas," she repeated. "Thomas Everett, it is perfect." Benjamin sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arms carefully around his wife and son, feeling like his heart might burst from the sheer intensity of his love for them. This was everything he had dreamed of, everything he had hoped for when he rode through that blizzard 2 years ago. This was family, home, the future made real. Thomas was a healthy baby with strong lungs and an even stronger will. He kept them awake at night with his crying and exhausted them during the day with his demands, but neither Benjamin nor Grace would have changed a thing. They were besotted with him, with every tiny finger and toe, every expression that crossed his small face. As Thomas grew, Benjamin watched Grace with wonder, seeing new depths to her love and strength. She was a natural mother, patient and nurturing, singing to Thomas in Spanish and English, telling him stories, teaching him about the world even when he was too young to understand. Benjamin fell in love with her all over again, seeing her in this new role, seeing the way she blossomed with motherhood. The years passed quickly, marked by Thomas's milestones and the steady growth of the ranch. Benjamin and Grace worked hard, building on the foundation they had established, expanding the herd, making improvements to the house and outbuildings. Grace's father's silver claim proved valuable after all, and the income from it allowed them to hire additional help and make investments that paid off handsomely. When Thomas was 3, Grace became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and while the pregnancy was still difficult, she handled it with more confidence. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1887, a tiny, perfect girl with auburn hair and Benjamin's dark eyes. "What shall we name her?" Benjamin asked, holding his daughter with the same awe he had felt holding Thomas for the first time. "Rose," Grace said without hesitation. "Rose for beauty and strength." "Rose Everett," Benjamin said, testing the name. "It is perfect." Rose was a different child than Thomas had been, quieter and more observant, content to watch the world rather than demand its attention. She adored her older brother, following him everywhere once she learned to walk, and Thomas was surprisingly gentle with her, protecting her with a fierceness that made both Benjamin and Grace smile. 2 years after Rose, they welcomed another son, whom they named Samuel. And 3 years after that, another daughter they called Elizabeth. The house that had once felt too large for just Benjamin and Grace was now filled with noise and laughter, and the organized chaos of a growing family. Through it all, Benjamin and Grace's love for each other only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, their moments of frustration and exhaustion, but they had learned to work through them, to communicate, to remember that they were partners in everything. On the hard days, they would find each other in the evening after the children were asleep, sitting together on the porch that looked out over the ranch, holding hands and watching the stars. "You remember that blizzard?" Grace asked one night, her head resting on Benjamin's shoulder. "Every day," Benjamin said. "It was the best decision I ever made riding out to you. Even though you could have died," Grace teased gently. "Even though," Benjamin confirmed, "because it brought me here to this life with you, I would make that ride 1,000 times over for this." Grace lifted her head to look at him, and in the starlight, Benjamin could see the same love in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for walking through the snow to bring me home." "You are my home," Benjamin said, kissing her softly. "Wherever you are, that is where I belong." The children grew, and the ranch prospered. Thomas showed an aptitude for ranching that made Benjamin proud, learning quickly and working hard, already talking about the day when he would run the operation himself. Rose had her mother's love of reading and learning, devouring every book they could acquire and teaching herself subjects far beyond what the small school in Oro Grande could provide. Samuel was adventurous and fearless, always climbing trees or riding horses too fast, giving his parents gray hairs with his antics. And Elizabeth, the baby, was sweet-natured and musical, singing constantly and begging Benjamin to teach her the harmonica. Benjamin and Grace watched their children grow with pride and wonder, marveling at the individuals they were becoming. On Sunday afternoons, the family would gather on the porch, Benjamin playing his harmonica while Grace and the children sang, and those moments felt sacred, like glimpses of heaven itself. The years brought challenges as well as joys. There were droughts that tested the ranch's resources and illness that swept through the territory, touching but mercifully not taking any of the family. There were accidents and injuries, moments of fear and worry. But through everything, Benjamin and Grace faced it together, leaning on each other and on the community they had become part of. Oro Grande itself grew and changed. New families moved in, drawn by the promise of silver and cattle and a fresh start. The town got a proper school and a doctor, a telegraph office and a bigger church. Benjamin served on the town council, and Grace helped establish a library, donating many of her own books to start the collection. They became pillars of the community, respected and loved, known for their generosity and their commitment to making Oro Grande a better place. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Benjamin planned a surprise for Grace. With the help of the older children, he organized a party at the community hall, inviting everyone they knew, decorating with flowers and candles. When he brought Grace into town under the pretense of attending a town meeting, she gasped at the sight of the celebration waiting for her. "Benjamin," she exclaimed, tears already streaming down her face. "What is all this?" "This is 20 years," Benjamin said, taking her hands in his. 20 years of the best life I could have imagined. 20 years of loving you. I wanted to celebrate that with everyone who has been part of our journey. The party was wonderful, filled with food and music and dancing and laughter. People told stories of Benjamin and Grace over the years, of their wedding, of their kindness to neighbors, of watching their family grow. As the evening drew to a close, Benjamin stood and raised his glass. 20 years ago I made a choice, he said, his voice carrying through the hall. There was a blizzard, and a woman I barely knew was alone on a homestead outside of town. I could have stayed safe in Oro Grande, could have told myself she would be fine, but I could not do it. Something in my heart told me I had to go to her, even if it killed me. He turned to Grace, who was watching him with shining eyes. That ride through the snow was the best decision I ever made. It brought me to you, Grace. It brought me to this life, this family, this love that fills every day. You are the reason I breathe, the reason I work, the reason everything I do matters. I love you more today than I did 20 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for being my wife, my partner, my everything. The hall erupted in applause, and Grace stood, crossing to Benjamin and kissing him while everyone cheered. I love you, she whispered against his lips. Forever. Forever, Benjamin echoed. As the years continued to pass, Benjamin and Grace grew older together, their hair graying, their bodies slowing, but their love remaining as strong as ever. They watched Thomas marry a kind young woman from a neighboring ranch and start a family of his own. They watched Rose become a teacher, dedicating herself to educating the next generation of children in Oro Grande. Samuel left for a time to seek his fortune in California, but returned, unable to stay away from the land and the family he loved. And Elizabeth married a musician who played in the church, and her voice could still be heard singing hymns every Sunday. The house remained full of life, with grandchildren visiting constantly, filling the rooms with noise and joy. Benjamin would sit on the porch with the little ones on his lap, telling them stories of the old days, of the blizzard and the ride through the snow, of the day he married their grandmother. Grace would bake cookies and read books, passing on her love of learning to a new generation. On a spring evening in 1911, 30 years after that fateful blizzard, Benjamin and Grace sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Benjamin was 76 now, Grace 72, and they had lived a lifetime together. "Do you have any regrets?" Grace asked quietly, her hand in his. Benjamin thought about the question. reviewing the years in his mind. The struggles and the triumphs, the heartaches and the joys, all of it woven together into the tapestry of their life. "Not a single one," he said finally. "Everything brought me here to this moment with you. How could I regret any of it?" "I feel the same," Grace said, leaning against him. "If I could go back and change anything, I would not, because it all led to this, to us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. Around them, the ranch that they had built together hummed with quiet activity, the next generation already taking over the work, carrying on the legacy that Benjamin and Grace had created. "Thank you," Grace said softly as the darkness deepened. "For what?" Benjamin asked, though he thought he knew. "For walking through the snow," Grace said. "For loving me enough to risk everything. For giving me this life." Benjamin turned to her, cupping her face in his weathered hands, looking into the green eyes that had captivated him from the very first moment. "You gave me just as much," he said. "You gave me everything, Grace. You are my miracle." They kissed as the stars came out above them, and in that moment they were young again, standing in a small adobe homestead while a blizzard raged outside, making promises that would last a lifetime. The snow had buried the road all those years ago, forcing Benjamin to walk miles to reach the woman he loved. But that journey had brought him home in a way he had never imagined, to a place not of geography but of the heart. And as they sat together in the twilight of their years, surrounded by the family and the life they had built, both Benjamin and Grace knew that every step through that snow, every moment of cold and fear and uncertainty, had been worth it. Because it had brought them to each other, and to this love that had sustained them through 3 decades, and would carry them through whatever years remained. The stars shone bright above the New Mexico territory, witnesses to a love story that had begun in a blizzard and had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting. In the house behind them, their children and grandchildren laughed and talked, the sound of family and home and continuity. And on the porch, Benjamin and Grace held each other, grateful for every moment, every day, every year they had been given together. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of spring and growing things, of hope and renewal. And in that moment, everything was perfect. Years later, when Benjamin was 81 and Grace was 77, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The entire town of Oro Grande turned out for the celebration, along with children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The community hall was decorated just as it had been for their 20th anniversary. But this time, there were more flowers, more candles, more people who wanted to honor the couple that had become legendary in the small New Mexico town. Thomas, now a distinguished man of 47 with silver threading through his dark hair, stood to give a speech. "My parents' love story has been the foundation of our family," he said, his voice strong and clear. "It has taught us what it means to commit fully, to love without reservation, to build something that lasts. My father rode through a blizzard to reach my mother, and in doing so, he showed us all what real love looks like. It looks like courage. It looks like sacrifice. It looks like choosing the person you love over and over again, every single day." Rose stood next, her eyes suspiciously bright. "My mother used to tell me that love was not just a feeling but a choice," she said. "A choice to stay, to work, to fight for each other even when it was hard." Watching my parents over the years, I have seen that truth lived out in 1,000 small ways. The way my father still opens doors for my mother. The way my mother still packs my father's favorite foods for lunch. The way they still hold hands when they walk. After 50 years, their love has not faded. It has only grown stronger. Samuel, Ever the adventurer spoke of how his parents had given him roots and wings, a home to always return to and the confidence to explore the world. And Elizabeth, now a mother of 4 herself, sang a song she had written for the occasion, her beautiful voice bringing tears to many eyes. When it was time for Benjamin and Grace to speak, they stood together, as they had done everything for 50 years. Benjamin spoke first, his voice a bit shakier than it had once been but still firm with conviction. 50 years ago, I married the love of my life, he said. I thought I knew what that meant, thought I understood the depth of what I was promising, but I was wrong. I had no idea how much deeper love could go, how much richer it could become with time. Every year with Grace has been better than the last. Every day, I wake up grateful that she chose me, that she has stayed beside me through everything life has thrown at us. He turned to Grace, taking both her hands in his. You are my heart, he said simply. You are the reason for everything good in my life. I would ride through 1,000 blizzards to reach you. Grace was crying openly now, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with emotion. Benjamin Everett walked through a snowstorm to bring me home, she said. But what he did not know then, what I did not know, was that he was not bringing me to a place. He was bringing me to him, because home is not where you are, home is who you are with. For 50 years, Benjamin has been my home. He has been my shelter in every storm, my comfort in every sorrow, my partner in every joy. I love him more today than I did on our wedding day, and that is saying something, because I loved him desperately even then. She turned to face him fully, ignoring the crowd around them, seeing only the man who had given her everything. Thank you, she said, for every day, for every moment, for every year of the most beautiful life I could have imagined. Benjamin pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and the hall erupted in applause and cheers that lasted for minutes. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling through their tears, surrounded by the family and community that was the living proof of their love. The party continued late into the night, but eventually, Benjamin and Grace returned to their ranch, to the house that had been their home for nearly 50 years. They sat on the porch in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the night, the cattle lowing in the distance, the wind through the trees, the hoot of an owl. 50 years, Grace marveled, her head on Benjamin's shoulder. It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. I know what you mean, Benjamin said, his arm around her waist. Some days I look at you and still see the young woman who opened her door to a half-frozen cowboy. Other days, I see every year we have lived together written in both our faces, and I think it is beautiful. We have had a good life, Grace said softly. The best life, Benjamin agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, and then Grace spoke again. When the time comes, she said carefully, when one of us has to say goodbye to the other, I want you to know something. Benjamin stiffened slightly, not wanting to think about that inevitable day, but Grace continued. I want you to know that I would not change a single thing, she said. Not one moment, not one day. The joy has been worth any pain that might come. Loving you has been worth everything. Benjamin felt tears sting his eyes. I feel the same, he said hoarsely, and I pray that when that day comes we go together. I cannot imagine this world without you in it. We will face it like we have faced everything else, Grace said. Together for as long as we are able. They sat on the porch until the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, neither wanting to break the spell of the night, neither ready to let go of this moment. And when they finally went inside, they went hand in hand, as they had done everything for 50 years. Benjamin and Grace were granted several more good years together. They grew frailer but not apart, still taking their evening walks around the property, still sitting together on the porch, still reaching for each other in the night. Their children and grandchildren visited often, filling the house with life and love, and Benjamin and Grace soaked it all in, grateful for every moment. On a warm summer evening in 1916, when Benjamin was 86 and Grace was 82, they sat together on their porch as the sun set. It had been a good day, filled with a visit from Samuel and his family, a feast prepared by Elizabeth, and laughter echoing through the rooms of the house. Now, in the quiet of evening, Benjamin and Grace held hands and watched the sky change colors. Benjamin had been feeling tired lately, his heart not as strong as it once was, but he felt peaceful, complete. "I love you," he said to Grace, the words as natural as breathing after 55 years of saying them. "I love you too," Grace replied, squeezing his hand gently. Benjamin leaned his head back against the chair, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on his face, the comfort of Grace beside him. "It has been a beautiful life," he said quietly. "The most beautiful," Grace agreed. And there, on the porch of the house they had made a home, surrounded by the land they had worked and loved, Benjamin closed his eyes. His last thought was of Grace, of the day he had ridden through a blizzard to reach her, of all the years between that moment and this one. His last feeling was of her hand in his, warm and familiar and beloved. Grace felt the moment he left her, felt the change in the hand she held. She did not cry out or call for help. Instead, she held his hand tighter and whispered, "Wait for me." Benjamin was laid to rest in the cemetery overlooking Oro Grande, in a plot with a view of the mountains and the vast New Mexico sky he had loved. The entire town turned out for the funeral, along with family from across the territory. Thomas spoke of his father's courage and integrity. Rose spoke of his gentleness and wisdom. Samuel spoke of his adventurous spirit and unfailing support. And Elizabeth sang, her voice breaking but beautiful, a hymn about going home. Grace stood at the graveside, dry-eyed and dignified, and when the service was over, she stayed behind after everyone else had left. She stood looking down at the fresh earth and spoke to the husband she had loved for 55 years. "You walked through snow to bring me home," she said quietly. "Now I will walk through whatever lies ahead to find you again. Wait for me, my love. I will not be long." True to her word, Grace followed Benjamin 3 months later. She simply went to sleep one night and did not wake up, a peaceful smile on her face. The doctor said her heart had simply stopped, worn out after 82 years of beating. But her children knew the truth. She had gone to find Benjamin, unable to bear being separated from him any longer. They buried Grace beside Benjamin on a crisp October day, the leaves turning gold and red around them. This time, it was the grandchildren who spoke, telling stories of their grandmother's kindness and strength, her love of learning and her generous heart. And Elizabeth sang again, the same hymn, and this time her voice did not break because she knew her mother was home. On the headstone, carved in simple letters, were their names and dates, and beneath them, a single line. The snow buried the road. He walked miles to bring her home. Love eternal. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own touches but preserving the heart of what Benjamin and Grace had built. The house on the porch where they had sat countless evenings remained, and it became tradition for the family to gather there on the anniversary of Benjamin and Grace's wedding, to tell their story to the children, to remember the love that had started it all. And on winter nights, when snow fell soft and thick over the New Mexico territory, people in Oro Grande would tell the story of Benjamin Everett, who had ridden through a blizzard to reach the woman he loved, and of Grace Kendrick, who had opened her door to a half-frozen cowboy and found her future. They would tell of 55 years of marriage, of a family built on a foundation of love and courage, of a legacy that lived on in every child and grandchild and great-grandchild. The story became legend, passed from generation to generation, a reminder of what real love looked like. It looked like a man willing to risk his life to make sure a woman was safe. It looked like a woman brave enough to say yes to the future despite her fear of loss. It looked like two people choosing each other every single day for 55 years. It looked like a life built together, one moment, one choice, one act of love at a time. And in the cemetery overlooking Oro Grande, two headstones stood side by side, beneath the vast New Mexico sky, eternal witnesses to a love that had defied blizzards and time itself. The snow had buried the road all those years ago, forcing a cowboy to walk miles to reach his destiny. But that walk had been the beginning of something beautiful, something that had rippled out to touch countless lives, something that would never truly end, because love like that does not die. It lives on in the stories we tell, in the families we build, in the choices we make to be brave and true and faithful. It lives on in every act of courage, every gesture of care, every moment when we choose love over fear, together over alone, home over anywhere else. Benjamin and Grace had lived that truth every day of their lives together. And in doing so, they had created something immortal. Not in the sense of living forever in the flesh, but in the sense of creating a love so powerful, so genuine, so complete that it would be remembered and honored for generations to come. The wind whispered through the cemetery, carrying the scent of sage and juniper, and somewhere in that wind, if you listened carefully, you might hear an echo of laughter, of two voices intertwined, of a love story that had begun in a blizzard and had never really ended at all. In the little church in Oro Grande, on a wooden plaque, someone had carved the words that summed up Benjamin and Grace's love story. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. But beneath it, in smaller letters, was added, and the greatest love of all is to live that life beside them every day, no matter what comes. That was the legacy Benjamin and Grace had left behind. Not just a family, not just a ranch, not just a town that remembered them fondly. They had left behind a blueprint for how to love completely, how to commit fully, how to build something that lasted not because it was easy, but because it was worth fighting for. And on cold winter nights, when the snow fell thick and fast over the New Mexico territory, people would look out their windows and remember the story of the cowboy who walked through a blizzard, and the woman who welcomed him home. They would remember that sometimes the greatest journeys we take are not measured in miles, but in the courage it takes to open our hearts, to risk everything, to choose love even when it terrifies us. Benjamin had walked miles through snow to bring Grace home. But in the end, they had brought each other home, to a place neither had known existed until they found it together. Home was not a location on a map. It was not a building or a town or a piece of land. Home was the space between two hearts that had chosen each other, the place where love lived and grew and flourished despite all obstacles. That was the gift Benjamin and Grace had given not just to their family, but to everyone who heard their story. The gift of knowing that real love exists, that it is worth fighting for, that it can weather any storm and last beyond death itself. The gift of hope, of faith, of believing that somewhere in this world, there is someone worth walking through blizzards for, someone who will open their door and welcome you home. And in a cemetery on a hill overlooking Oro Grande, New Mexico, two people rest side by side, their journey complete, their love eternal, their story forever woven into the fabric of the West they had helped to build. The snow had buried the road. The cowboy had walked miles to bring her home. And in doing so, He had created a love story for the ages, one that would never be forgotten as long as people believed in the power of love to transform, to heal, and to endure.